As I sit down to write this, I can feel the weight of the memories weighing heavily on my mind. I may not be the best writer, and my vocabulary may be limited, but the story I am about to tell is one that has haunted me since my childhood. I was about 12 years old when me and my family moved into a small, quaint house in the countryside. It was a beautiful old house with creaky wooden floors and a large garden filled with blooming flowers. My parents were thrilled with the place, but I had an uneasy feeling about it right from the start. It wasn't long before strange things began happening in the house. At first, it was just little things like objects moving on their own or doors closing by themselves. My parents brushed it off as the old house settling in, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. One night, when I was lying in bed, I heard a faint whispering coming from the corner of my room. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like gibberish. I tried to ignore it and convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the whispering continued every night. As the days went by, the whispering grew louder and more clear. It sounded like multiple voices talking at once, and it always seemed to be coming from the same corner of my room. I was terrified, but I didn't want to tell my parents and make them think I was going crazy. One day, while I was playing in the backyard, I noticed a small, old shed hidden in the corner of the garden. I had never seen it before, and I was curious, so I opened the door and peered inside. The interior of the shed was dark and musty, but I could make out a figure sitting in the corner. I quickly shut the door and ran back to the house, my heart racing. That night, the whispering was louder than ever. I was too scared to fall asleep, so I stayed awake listening to the voices. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and I heard a loud banging coming from the shed. It sounded like someone was trying to break out. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, telling them about the shed and the voices. My parents were skeptical, but they decided to investigate the shed the next day. When we opened the door, we found nothing but an empty, abandoned room. My parents assured me that it was probably just my imagination, but I knew what I had heard and seen. Things only got worse from there. More strange occurrences began happening in the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started having nightmares every night, dreams of the shed and the voices. I couldn't sleep anymore, my fear consuming me. One day, while I was playing with my younger brother in the backyard, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden. It was dark and twisted, with long, thin arms and no face. I froze in fear, unable to move or scream. The figure disappeared when my brother called out to me, but I knew it was real. It was the same figure I had seen in the shed. As the years went by, my fear only grew stronger. My parents didn't believe me anymore, thinking it was just a phase I was going through. But I knew the truth. That shed was haunted, and it was trying to communicate with me. When I turned 18, I moved out of the house, leaving my family behind. I couldn't bear to live in that house any longer. But even in my new home, the voices and the figures followed me. They haunted my dreams and whispered in my ear, tormenting me day and night. It wasn't until I turned 25 and had my first child that I decided to confront my fears. I went back to my old house, determined to find the answers I had been searching for all these years. With the help of a spiritual medium, I learned that the shed was used by a man who had a mental illness. He would lock himself in the shed and talk to himself in multiple voices. He was a disturbed man who eventually took his own life in the shed, leaving his tormented soul behind. My heart broke for the man, and I finally understood why the voices were calling out to me. They wanted me to know the truth, to know their story. And so I left the house for good, at peace with what had happened. But to this day I still hear the whispers and see the figure in my dreams. Some may say it was all in my head, but I know the truth. The shed, the voices, and the figure were all real, and they will always be a part of my disturbing true story from my childhood. Growing up, my siblings and I would often gather around the fireplace, nestled in blankets and pillows, and listen to our parents tell us scary stories. They would always warn us that these were true stories from their own childhood, but we never really believed them. That is, until one night when they shared with us the most disturbing story we had ever heard. It was a dark and stormy night, just like in the movies. My parents were about the same age as my siblings and I are now, and they lived in a small town in the countryside. They were always adventurous and curious, often exploring the woods and abandoned buildings that surrounded their town. One day, they heard rumors about a haunted house on the outskirts of the town. The locals believed that it was cursed, and anyone who entered would never return. Of course, my parents didn't believe in such things, and decided to investigate. They convinced their friends, a set of twins named Ethan and Emma, to join them on their adventure. As they approached the house, they could feel a sense of unease wash over them. The house was old and dilapidated, with broken windows and an overgrown garden. The front door was slightly ajar, inviting them in. Without hesitation, they pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing they noticed was the eerie silence that filled the house. It was as if time had stopped, and the house was frozen in a moment of darkness. The only sound they could hear was the creaking of the floorboards under their feet. They explored the ground floor, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But as they made their way up to the second floor, they noticed strange symbols etched into the walls. They couldn't make out what they meant, but they all felt a sense of dread wash over them. As they entered one of the bedrooms, they saw a small, handwritten note lying on the floor. It read, "Get out. Leave this place, or suffer the consequences." But my parents and their friends were not easily scared, and they brushed it off as a prank. They continued exploring, but as they made their way to the third floor, they heard a loud thumping sound coming from the attic. My parents, being the brave ones, decided to check it out while Ethan and Emma stayed behind on the second floor. As they climbed the stairs to the attic, they could feel the temperature drop drastically. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. But they were determined to find out what was causing the noise. When they reached the attic, they saw a figure standing in the corner, facing away from them. It was tall and slender, with long black hair that covered its face. They couldn't see its features, but they could feel its piercing gaze on them. Without warning, the figure let out an ear-piercing scream and charged at them. My parents and their friends ran for their lives, barely making it out of the house before the figure could catch them. They never went back to the haunted house again, but that wasn't the end of their nightmare. Strange things started happening to them after that night. They would wake up to find their furniture rearranged, their belongings missing, and sometimes they would hear strange whispering voices in their room at night. They tried to tell their parents, but they didn't believe them. They thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But my parents knew that it was something more sinister. They could feel a dark presence following them wherever they went. Years went by and my parents and their friends grew up, but they could never forget that terrifying night at the haunted house. They never spoke about it again, until that dark and stormy night when they shared the story with my siblings and me. As they finished their story, we could see the fear and unease in their eyes. They told us that even though they may not have believed in ghosts and curses before, that experience changed their minds forever. To this day, whenever I pass by that old abandoned house, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine, and I can't help but wonder what really happened to my parents and their friends that night. Was it just their imagination, or was it something more sinister that still lurks in that haunted house? I guess we'll never know for sure, and that's what makes it even more disturbing. I was 10 years old when my family moved into an old, rundown house in the countryside. My parents thought it would be a great opportunity to start fresh and leave the busy city life behind. But little did we know the haunting experience that awaited us. The house was surrounded by tall, creepy trees that seemed to tower over me. As we walked up to the front door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over me. The paint was chipped and the windows were cracked, giving the house an eerie vibe. My parents were excited about the move, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about this place. As we entered the house, an unnerving chill ran down my spine. My older brother Jake, who was 13 at the time, seemed unfazed by the house, but I could see a hint of unease in his eyes. We settled into our new home, and for the first few days, everything seemed normal. But then strange things started happening. I would wake up in the middle of the night to whispering voices, even though my brother was sound asleep next to me. And every morning I would find all the doors in the house wide open, even though we made sure to lock them before going to bed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then one night, I saw something that I'll never be able to forget. I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. I thought it was just my parents checking on me, so I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. But then the footsteps didn't stop. They kept getting closer and closer to my room. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the door handle turned slowly. I peeked through my lashes and saw a figure standing at the doorway. It was a little girl with pale skin and long black hair. She was staring right at me, but her eyes were empty, as if all life had been drained out of her. I screamed and woke up my parents, but when they switched on the lights, there was no one there. They dismissed it as just a bad dream, but I knew what I saw was real. The sightings of the little girl became more frequent, and I started to avoid being alone in the house. I could tell my parents didn't believe me, but Jake did. He had started experiencing strange things too. We would often hear laughter coming from the attic, even though we never went up there. And sometimes we would find old toys and dolls scattered around the house that we didn't own. My parents decided to have the house checked for any unusual occurrences, but the findings were inconclusive. They also tried to sell the house, but no one seemed interested. Eventually, we just learned to live with the strange happenings as a family. But as time went by, the hauntings became more intense. My parents would wake up with bruises on their bodies, and Jake and I would often wake up with scratches on our arms and legs. It was as if the spirits in the house didn't want us there. One day, while exploring the attic, Jake and I found an old photo album. As we flipped through the pages, we came across a picture of a little girl who looked exactly like the one I saw that night. Underneath the picture, there was a handwritten note that read, "Caroline, age 7. Died tragically in this house." We were shocked and scared. We did some research and found out that the previous owners had a daughter named Caroline, who died in the house. And with that, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The strange occurrences, the little girl, everything. That night, we gathered our courage and went to the attic to confront Caroline's spirit. We apologized for intruding in her home and promised to leave the next day. And just like that, all the haunting stopped. We never experienced anything strange in that house again. We moved out the very next day, and to this day, I can't shake off the memories of that disturbing experience from my childhood. It still gives me chills, and I'm glad we never have to go back to that house again. It has taught me to always trust my instincts and never ignore the signs of a haunting. The spirits of the dead are not to be disturbed, or else they will disturb you in return.